My parents didn't just abandon me at 11, they liquidated me like a toxic asset. They traded a daughter for a fresh start, leaving nothing but a yellow sticky note and the silence of a cold kitchen. 18 years later, they've crawled back, salivating over Aunt Dahlia's millions, convinced the little girl they discarded is a ghost they can finally cash in. But my name is Wanda Mountain, and while they spent 18 years forgetting I existed, I spent every waking second auditing their sins. Today, they aren't here for a payday. They're here for a reckoning. The phantom scent of that old, stale burrito still haunts my lungs, a sharper sting than the sub-zero air currently whipping across the Gold Coast. I feel the federal badge in my inner pocket, the only thing heavier than my heart, as I watch the predators approach. They think they're walking into a fortune, unaware that the daughter they erased is the one holding the ledger. I settle into the shadows of the stone archway, my mind already calculating the final cost of their arrival, as the heavy iron gates of the Carlton estate groaned as they swung open. The heavy iron gates of the Carlton estate groaned as they swung open, a low metallic protest against the biting Chicago wind. Outside, the world was a blur of aggressive white, a January blizzard that seemed intent on burying the Gold Coast in a frozen shroud. I stood under the stone portico, my breath hitching in the frigid air, watching a rented Cadillac Escalade crawl up the driveway like a predator scenting a kill. I pulled my wool coat tighter, feeling the expensive fabric against my skin, a gift from Aunt Dahlia that felt more like armor than clothing. 18 years. That is how long it had been since I last looked into the eyes of the people in that car. 18 years of building a life out of the scraps they left behind. I stood there, a mask of forensic neutrality etched onto my face, wondering if they would even recognize the woman I had become. Have you ever stood in front of someone who shares your blood, only to realize you are looking at a complete stranger? The car came to a jerky halt. Hadden and Vila climbed out, their movements frantic as they fought the wind. They were shivering, their faces pinched with the kind of irritation that comes from a life of unearned comfort. Vila didn't even look up as she reached the portico. Without a word, she thrust a damp, heavy fur coat and a leaking bag of travel trash into my hands. "Take these inside, girl," she snapped, her voice raspy from the cold. "And be careful with that fur. It costs more than you'll see in a lifetime." I accepted the items with a slight, graceful nod. I chose not to speak. I've learned that the greatest wisdom is knowing when silence is more powerful than any introduction. I looked at my mother's face, withered by time and a decade of sour choices, and realized that while her beauty had faded, her sense of entitlement had only sharpened. She didn't see Wanda. She saw a servant. She had erased me so thoroughly from her mind that I had become part of the furniture. The heavy front door clicked shut behind us as Ziana and Skylar burst into the foyer. Their heels hammered against the marble floors, a sharp, rhythmic intrusion into the house's mournful quiet. They didn't stop to mourn. They began appraising. Their eyes darted from the crystal chandeliers to the oil paintings, their expressions shifting into the hungry calculation of scavengers at a feast. "This place is so dated," Skylar whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "The first thing we do is gut this wallpaper. It smells like old money and mothballs." Gianna turned to me, her chin tilted in that familiar, arrogant arc. "Don't just stand there. My feet are freezing. Go make some tea, Earl Grey, and make sure the water is actually boiling this time. And where did Dahlia keep the silver? We need to start an inventory." A sharp, cold memory pierced my composure, a flashback to my 11th birthday. I remembered the silence of our old kitchen, the hum of an empty refrigerator, and that yellow sticky note. "Stay at a friend's. Back in a week." They had liquidated me like a bad stock option to save their own social standing. Now, they were back to claim the legacy of the woman who had actually raised me. I didn't snap, I didn't scream. Instead, I noticed Hadden's hands. They were blue, shaking uncontrollably from the Chicago frost. Despite everything, a flicker of the compassion Dahlia taught me remained. I reached out and quietly adjusted the foyer's thermostat, boosting the heat to take the sting out of his bones. To be bitter is to let those who hurt you live in your head rent-free, and I refused to give them the keys to my peace. Hadden paced the foyer, his eyes fixed on the closed library doors. "Where's the lawyer?" Where are the important people? We've been driving for hours. He spared a dismissive glance in my direction. Tell the girl to hurry up with that tea, Vela. We don't have time to waste on formalities. We have debts to settle and a future to claim. I retreated into the shadows of the butler's pantry to hang the damp coats. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the hangers, listening to the muffled voices in the next room. They were already arguing, carving up a pie they hadn't baked. I heard the word millions tossed around like a common noun, followed by hushed, panicked talk of foreclosures and looming bank notices. They saw Aunt Dahlia's death as their ultimate bailout, a final check from a woman they hadn't called in a decade. I pulled my phone from my pocket. A single encrypted notification from Thalion waited on the screen. The vault is locked. Project Zero is active. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the pantry wall. Integrity isn't something you inherit. It's something you build when the world leaves you with nothing but the truth. My family thought they were coming for a fortune. They didn't realize they were walking into an audit, one where every lie they ever told had been meticulously recorded in red ink. The sound of a heavy car door slamming echoed through the house. Thalion had arrived. I smoothed my coat and walked toward the library doors, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. I realized that by tomorrow, my family wouldn't just know who I was, they would realize I was the only person standing between them and the abyss. As the heavy library doors creaked open, Hadden looked up with a sneer. "Where is the lawyer, girl? We don't have all day." The blizzard outside had transformed from a picturesque snowfall into a violent whiteout, the wind rattling the heavy window panes of the Carlton estate. Inside, the atmosphere was even more turbulent, though masked by the clinking of crystal and the jarring beat of pop music Skylar had blasted from her phone. I stood in the doorway of the grand dining room, watching my family occupy a space they had never respected. Vela and Ziana were already rummaging through Aunt Dahlia's lacquered cabinets, their fingers tracing the gold-rimmed china with a hunger that made my skin crawl. They weren't mourning a woman, they were inventorying a prize. Hadden burst into the room, his face flushed with a sudden, triumphant heat. In his hand, he clutched a dusty bottle of 1996 Dom Perignon, Aunt Dahlia's absolute favorite, saved for a milestone she never got to reach. Before I could breathe a word of protest, the cork popped with a sharp, celebratory crack that echoed like a gunshot through the somber halls. He raised the bottle, pouring the pale, bubbling liquid into 4 flutes with a reckless hand. "To liberation!" Hadden cheered, his voice booming with a terrifying lack of shame. "To the end of the Mountain family's dry spell and the beginning of the Carlton bailout." I walked forward to serve the light dinner I had prepared, my movements precise and silent. I watched them toast to the death of the only woman who had truly seen me. It struck me then that some people view a funeral not as a final goodbye, but as a clearance sale for a life they didn't help build. Despite the bile rising in my throat, I reached out and quietly placed a leather coaster under Hadden's glass. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for the antique mahogany table Dahlia had loved so much. Grace isn't about how others treat you, but about how you maintain your own standards in the face of their chaos. Dahlia was always too rich for her own good, Vela laughed, her eyes glittering as she sipped the expensive vintage. She sat on all this while we struggled. Honestly, she's lucky she had family like us to finally take over and put this money to real use. I remained an observant, silent shadow against the wall, my mind recording every word. Have you ever wondered how people can justify their cruelty by convincing themselves they are the victims? Looking back now, I should have seen that their entitlement was a bottomless pit. I excused myself quietly, the champagne bubbles in their glasses looking like tiny, dying stars. I retreated into the darkened hallway, the transition from the noise of the dining room to the silence of the corridor feeling like a physical weight. I made my way toward the security monitors near the library. Through a gap in the heavy oak doors, I spotted Hadden hunched over a burner phone, his voice a frantic whisper as he spoke to someone hidden in the shadows of the study. I pressed my back against the cold wallpaper, my forensic mind shifting into high gear as I eavesdropped on a conversation that would have broken a lesser woman. "The death certificate for the minor," Hadden hissed into the receiver. "We need to file it as a presumption of death. If we can prove Wanda vanished back in 2008, there's no way any lost heirs can crawl out of the woodwork to contest the estate. My heart didn't race. It turned to ice. They weren't just planning to take the money. They were planning to legally erase me from existence. Again, Hadden continued, outlining a scheme to use my social security number, stolen from old tax returns, to shield their fraudulent LLCs from a looming federal audit. They wanted to make me a legal ghost, a vessel to carry the weight of their financial sins while they walked away with Dahlia's millions. I felt the familiar sting of being discarded, but I didn't let it blind me. I pulled out my own device and activated the remote recording interface. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone the opportunity to destroy you a second time. The blue light of my screen illuminated my face in the dark hallway, my expression hardening into one of professional calculation. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a witness. I realized then that my parents didn't just fear the truth. They had forgotten that I was the one who knew how to find it. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew I was no longer playing by their rules. I returned to the dining room just as a gust of wind sent a chill through the floorboards. Skylar let out a dramatic shiver, complaining about the ghastly draft in the ancient tomb of a house. I walked to the linen closet and retrieved a handmade quilt. One Dahlia had started knitting for me during my first winter here, her stitches uneven but filled with a warmth no furnace could replicate. I draped it gently over Skylar's shoulders, a final gesture of the kindness I had been taught. "What is this?" Skylar scoffed, clutching the fabric with 2 fingers before shoving it off her lap and onto the floor. "It's trashy and old. It smells like a thrift store. Don't touch me with this junk, Wanda." I knelt down and picked up the quilt, brushing off the invisible dust with a gentle hand. I didn't feel the need to argue or defend the hours of love woven into those threads. Lions do not lose sleep over the opinions of sheep, and I refused to lose my peace over those who couldn't see the value in a simple thread of love. At that moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification that the encrypted files for the probate hearing had successfully synced with the court's server. The legal trap was set, and the blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing in my digital vault. I looked at my parents one last time, their faces blurred by the expensive wine and their own delusions of grandeur. Hadden was leaning back, his heels resting on the table, looking like a man who believed the world finally owed him a favor. I didn't realize it then, but that was the last time I would ever look at them with even a shred of pity. "I hope you enjoy the wine, Hadden," I said, my voice a calm, steady whisper that cut through the music. Tomorrow, the vintage of the truth might be a bit harder to swallow. Hadden sneered over his glass, barely sparing me a glance. "Don't worry about us, girl. Just make sure the breakfast is hot at 8 sharp. We have a very big day ahead." I retreated from the dining room as the clock struck midnight, leaving behind the hollow echoes of my parents' laughter. The blizzard rattled the limestone walls of the Carlton estate, but inside Aunt Dahlia's private wing, the silence was absolute and heavy with secrets. I stood before the door to her office, my thumb hovering over the biometric scanner. With a soft click, the system recognized me, granting entry to a sanctuary my parents had spent the last 6 hours trying to breach. It was a silent testament to the deep trust Dahlia had placed in me, a trust built on years of shared silence and forensic precision. The room smelled of aged vellum and the sharp, metallic scent of high-end ink. I crossed the floor to the primary terminal, the hum of the cooling fans sounding like the first breath of a sleeping giant. As a forensic accountant, I knew that while people often hide behind elaborate lies and emotional manipulation, numbers always remain loyal to the truth. They don't have egos or agendas. They simply exist as the indelible fingerprints of human greed. I began the audit of retribution, syncing the local server with the encrypted cloud drive I had prepared for lawyer Thalion. Dahlia had been more than my guardian. She had been my mentor in the art of survival. As the terminal screen flickered to life, I discovered folders dating back a decade, meticulous records of the Mountain family's financial decay. She had monitored their every move, anticipating the exact moment their debts would force them to come crawling back to her doorstep. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't just her niece or her heir. I was the hand-picked executor of a long-planned lesson in accountability. I moved to the hidden floor safe beneath the heavy mahogany desk, the combination etched only into my memory. Inside lay a physical, red, leather-bound ledger. My breath hitched as I turned the first page. This wasn't just a book of business transactions. It was a record of every cent Dahlia had paid Hadden and Vila since 2008. The entries were chilling. My parents hadn't just abandoned me. They had repeatedly tried to sell my location and contact rights back to Dahlia over the years. Every time they needed a new car or a vacation for Gianna and Skylar, they had threatened to disrupt my peace by demanding I return to them. And every time Dahlia had paid them millions to stay away, effectively buying my freedom over and over again. I found a handwritten note tucked into the center of the book. Wanda, your value was never determined by the price they set for your departure, but by the strength you built in their absence. Tears blurred my vision, hitting the page like heavy raindrops. I had spent 18 years wondering what I did wrong to be left behind, only to realize that my abandonment was actually a rescue funded by Dahlia's quiet, fierce love. Have you ever felt the profound weight of realizing someone was willing to bleed for you while you thought you were alone? I whispered a thank you into the empty air of the room. Real family isn't about whose blood flows in your veins, but who is willing to protect your peace at any cost. The investigative rhythm took over as I cross-referenced the red ledger with Hadden's most recent bank statements. My fingers flew across the keyboard, uncovering a massive trail of wire fraud. They hadn't just stolen from Aunt Dahlia. They had used my stolen Social Security number to secure a $5 million predatory loan to fund their failing LLCs. It was a perfect legal trap. I compiled the digital evidence, sworn affidavits from Dahlia's former security team, and high-resolution scans of the ledger. I noticed a small framed photo resting near the monitor. It was from my 12th birthday, the first year I felt I truly had a home. I touched the glass over Dahlia's smiling face and made a silent vow to protect the legacy she had worked so hard to preserve. She didn't want revenge. She wanted justice to be the final word in her story. I hit the send button on the final encrypted package to Thalion, the status bar reaching 100% with a satisfying chime. The audit was complete, and the debt was finally due. I sat back in the chair, watching the first gray light of a snow-covered Saturday morning bleed through the curtains. I didn't realize it then, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the legal avalanche I had just triggered. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a victim of my parents' greed. I felt like the architect of their reckoning. A sudden heavy thumping on the office door shattered the morning stillness. The handle rattled violently as Hadden's voice barked through the thick wood, stripped of any pretense of paternal warmth. "Wanda, open this door! Why is the help locked in my sister's office at this hour? I know what you're doing in there!" I stood slowly, my face reflecting in the dark monitor like a ghost from his past. I smoothed my hair and walked toward the door, my footsteps silent on the rug. "It's not your office yet, Hadden," I whispered to the empty air as the handle began to rattle with desperate, frantic energy. I pulled the office door open just as Hadden's fist was raised for another heavy strike against the oak. He stood there, red-faced and trembling with a rage that seemed to vibrate through his expensive, rented suit. I didn't flinch. I simply stepped out and closed the door firmly behind me, clicking the biometric lock into place. My body became an immovable barrier, blocking his view of the dual monitors where the truth of his financial crimes was still scrolling in neon green. Hadden tried to push past me, his breath smelling of stale champagne and desperation. "Move aside, girl. I need to secure my sister's business records before the lawyers get here. This isn't a game for the house staff." I remained a pillar of forensic neutrality, my voice dropping into a low, steady register that seemed to deflate his aggression. A man who cannot control his temper can never control his destiny, Hadden. And right now, your destiny is waiting in the breakfast room. I could see the flicker of terror in his eyes, the raw, animal fear of a man who knows the debt collectors are no longer just calling, but standing at the gate. His anger was merely a thin, brittle mask for his bankruptcy. Have you ever noticed how the loudest people are often the ones with the most to hide? I led him toward the formal dining area, where the morning sun hit the silverware with an icy, unforgiving brilliance. Vela was already there, her face carefully painted with a motherly concern that felt more offensive than Hadden's overt hostility. "Wanda dear, please sit," Vela said, her voice dripping with a calculated sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Hadden, stop shouting. Aggression is just the noise made by a man who has run out of options. Let's try to find some dignity in the morning air instead." I sat across from them, my spine perfectly straight, watching the performance of regret unfold. Vela reached across the table, attempting to take my hand with fingers that felt like cold silk. She began to weep softly, spinning a narrative of lost years, and how they were forced by cruel circumstances to leave me behind in 2008. It was a practice script, polished by years of social climbing and selective memory. "We never stopped loving you, Wanda," she whispered, dabbing at a dry eye. "We just want to make sure you're protected now. Family is all we have left." They slid a document across the mahogany table, something they called a family support agreement. They claimed it was a covenant to ensure I would be taken care of after the will was read. My forensic accountant eyes didn't even need a second glance to identify the poison in the ink. It was a fraudulent power of attorney combined with a debt assumption clause. They weren't looking for a daughter. They were looking for a financial scapegoat to carry the weight of their predatory loans. The document lacked a legal notary and used the kind of deceptive language that would have a first-year law student in stitches. It was a blatant violation of Illinois probate law, designed to trick a girl they still believed was naive and uneducated. I remembered Aunt Dahlia's most vital lesson. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I didn't feel anger, only a terrifyingly calm precision. I folded the document slowly and placed it in my inner coat pocket. It wasn't an agreement. It was evidence for my records. I stood up and walked to the silver carafe, pouring 2 cups of coffee. I handed one to Hadden and one to Vela. Hadden took a large gulp and immediately grimaced, slamming the porcelain cup back onto its saucer with a clatter. "This is stone cold," he barked, glaring at me. "What kind of service is this?" I looked him directly in the eye, my voice devoid of heat or malice. "Love, like coffee, becomes bitter when it's left in the cold for 18 years, Hadden. You shouldn't be surprised that the warmth has evaporated." The room fell into a suffocating silence. I officially informed them that I would not be signing their agreement or any other document they produced. My peace of mind was not for sale, and I no longer recognized their authority over my life, my name, or my future. Walking away isn't about being weak. It's about knowing your worth is not subject to someone else's inability to see it. I realized then that the final cord of filial obligation had finally snapped. I didn't realize it then, but the moment I stood up from that table, I had already won. I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if the 13-year-old girl in me had finally stopped waiting for them to come back and save her. That's where the old story ended and the audit began. The sound of a heavy card door slamming outside broke the tension like a thunderclap. Through the frost-covered window, I saw Thalion's black sedan pull up, the official court-sealed folders visible on his passenger seat. Suddenly, the front doors burst open. Gianna and Skylar stumbled into the breakfast room, their faces pale and their hands trembling as they clutched their glowing phones. Gianna looked at me, her voice a shrill, panicked scream that shattered the morning quiet. "Wanda, what did you do? Why is there a legal notice from the IRS appearing on my social media account?" The breakfast room had barely stopped echoing with Gianna's shrill panic before the air in the Carlton estate turned thick and suffocating. My family moved like a pack of cornered wolves, their movements frantic and uncoordinated as they realized the digital walls were closing in. I didn't have time to answer Gianna's question about the IRS. I was already being herded toward Aunt Dahlia's private library. Hadden's hand gripped my arm with a desperate, bruising strength, while Vela and the sisters followed, their faces masks of pure financial terror. They slammed the heavy mahogany doors shut behind us, clicking the lock with a finality that transformed the sanctuary of books into a psychological pressure cooker. Through the tall, frosted windows, I could see Lawyer Thalion's black sedan parked at the portico. He was stepping out, briefcase in hand, oblivious to the ambush happening just yards away. Ziana thrust her phone inches from my eyes, the glowing screen displaying a federal notice of asset seizure that had effectively paralyzed her social media-fueled lifestyle. Hadden didn't bother with the facade of fatherly love anymore. His face was a contorted map of desperation, the skin tight over his cheekbones, his eyes bloodshot from a night of heavy drinking and looming ruin. "You parasite," Hadden hissed, his voice dropping into a low, guttural growl that vibrated with malice. "You've been whispering in Dahlia's ear for years, haven't you? Poisoning her against us while you sat here in luxury. Hand over the master passwords for the offshore accounts. Now. Before that lawyer walks through those doors and freezes everything else." I stood my ground in the center of the room, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I watched them with the detached, analytical precision of a forensic auditor. It is a sobering truth that a person's real character is never revealed in their moments of success. It is laid bare by how they handle the suffocating fear of losing their power. They weren't fighting for Dahlia's legacy. They were fighting for the right to keep pretending they were important. Have you ever seen someone lose their soul just to keep up appearances? I realized then that my family was no longer a group of people. They were a collection of debts searching for a host. "The passwords aren't yours to take, Hadden," I said, my voice cutting through their frantic energy like a scalpel. "And they never will be. You didn't come here to mourn. You came here to scavenge, and the body isn't even cold yet." Hadden's eyes narrowed, a cruel, triumphant smirk slowly spreading across his lips. It was the look of a man who believed he had found the ultimate trump card. He reached into his inner pocket and produced a sheaf of papers, tossing them onto the leather-topped desk with a flourish. It was a psychiatric evaluation, stamped by a doctor whose name I immediately flagged as a notorious signature for hire in the corrupt corners of the Illinois Medical Board. The document claimed Aunt Dahlia had suffered from advanced, undiagnosed dementia during her final 5 years, the exact period during which she had restructured her estate and named me the primary beneficiary. "This will hold up in any court in Chicago," Viola chimed in, her voice cold and devoid of its earlier practiced sweetness. "We will sue you for elder abuse and undue influence. We'll tell the DA and the police that you manipulated a mentally incompetent woman to strip her rightful heirs of their birthright. Unless, of course, you sign this." She produced a second document, a full confession and a waiver of all my legal rights to the Carlton estate. The sheer cruelty of defaming the woman who had saved me, just to satisfy their greed, hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They were willing to paint Aunt Dahlia as a senile victim rather than admit she was a brilliant woman who saw through their lies. I felt a surge of fury, but I didn't let it reach my face. I remembered what Dahlia always told me. Those who cannot build anything themselves will always try to burn down the legacies of others. I looked at the forged report, my mind already cross-referencing the date on the header with the business logs I had audited just hours ago. "I will not let your lies tarnish the memory of a woman whose only sin was being more honorable than the family she was born into," I whispered. My voice was steady, but it carried the weight of 18 years of suppressed truth. I understood then that the civil route, the polite, family dispute route, was officially dead. They had engaged in a criminal gambit, and I was the only person in the room equipped to fight it. I didn't reach for their pen. Instead, I pulled my encrypted tablet from the bookshelf where I had hidden it. I didn't need to argue, I needed to execute. I opened the live feed from the house's security system, showing the library's hidden cameras. Cameras Hadden had forgotten were installed during the high-tech renovation I had overseen 3 years ago. I then pulled up Dahlia's travel and business logs from the date of the psychiatric evaluation on their report. On that exact day, Aunt Dahlia had been in London, chairing a board meeting for a multinational corporation, her cognitive clarity witnessed by 32 high-level executives and captured on international news feeds. "Truth is like a diamond, Hadden," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, sharp clarity. "The more you try to crush it, the more it cuts you. You haven't just produced a fake report. You have committed attestation fraud and attempted extortion in a room equipped with federal-grade surveillance. This isn't a probate dispute anymore. This is a criminal record." Their faces drained of color as the reality of my words began to sink in. They had brought a forged doctor's note to a forensic accountant's battlefield, and I had just dismantled their entire existence in under 60 seconds. The sound of Thalian's authoritative knock echoed against the library doors. I reached for the lock, feeling the cold brass under my palm. I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the unwanted daughter or the invisible middle child. I was the arbiter of their fate. I leaned close to Hadden, my eyes promising a storm he wasn't prepared for. "You shouldn't have brought those papers here, Hadden. The gates of the abyss are open. Step inside." I turned the lock with a firm, decisive click. Looking back, I realized that was the moment the old world ended. I didn't realize it then, but the next hour would change the definition of family forever. The heavy oak doors of the library didn't just open, they felt like the seal of a tomb being cracked. Lawyer Thalian walked in with the clinical grace of a surgeon entering an operating theater, his leather briefcase clicking as he set it upon the polished mahogany table. The blizzard outside seemed to pause, or perhaps the tension in the room was simply so immense it had frozen time itself. Hadden, Vila, and the sisters didn't just sit. They perched on the edges of their chairs, their eyes darting with a primal, animalistic hunger. They were vultures who had finally spotted the carcass, unaware that the prey they were circling was the one holding the gun. Thalian sat at the head of the table, his hands steady as he broke the wax seal on a thick black folder. He didn't look at them. He looked at the paperwork with a terrifyingly neutral focus. "We are here for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Dahlia Carlton," he began, his voice cutting through the stale air. "Specifically to address the Project Zero amendment drafted 6 months ago." He cleared his throat and began to read, the words landing like heavy stones in a quiet pool. "To Hadden and Vila Mountain, the siblings who defined my early years and abandoned my legacy in my final ones, I leave exactly what they gave to the most vulnerable member of their bloodline 18 years ago. A zero balance, a cancelled check, and the silence of an empty house." The air left the room in a single, collective gasp. Thalian didn't stop. He detailed the specific legal mechanics Dahlia had put in place. Their current primary residence in the suburbs, the one they had bragged about for years, was not actually theirs. It was owned by a Carlton-controlled LLC, and according to the instructions, the lease was to be terminated effective immediately. They were to be evicted within 48 hours. They weren't just losing an inheritance, they were losing the very roof over their heads. I watched Hadden's face. The flush of arrogance had been replaced by a ghost white sheet of pure, unadulterated terror. Justice is not a punishment, I realized. It is merely a mirror reflecting your own actions back at you until you are forced to look. Thalian closed the folder for a brief second, looking directly at Hadden. "Probate is not a negotiation of love, Mr. Mountain. It is a verification of debt. And your debt to this estate, and to the person sitting across from you, is insurmountable." The silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the room descended into a chaotic, screaming madness. Vela collapsed back into her chair, her hands fluttering to her throat as she wailed about family loyalty and Christian charity. Ziana and Skylar were on their feet, their voices shrill and jagged as they accused Thalian of being bribed, of being a liar, of working with the help to steal their birthright. Have you ever seen the mask of civility slip so far it reveals the rot beneath? It was a pathetic display of the vulture's realization that the feast was actually a trap. Hadden slammed his fist onto the table, the vibration rattling the crystal inkwell. "I'll contest this. I'll sue every one of you. That forged report I showed you. Dahlia was insane. She was senile. You can't leave a house to a servant while your own blood starves." I remained seated, my hands folded calmly on the table. I observed their tantrum with a profound, bone-deep pity. Those who live by the sword of deception eventually fall upon the sharp edge of their own lies, and Hadden was bleeding out in front of me. I didn't realize it then, but my silence was the loudest thing in the room. I let them scream until their lungs burned and their faces were purple. "A house built on sand cannot complain when the tide finally comes in, Hadden," I said. My voice was a calm, steady anchor in their storm. "You didn't lose this today. You lost it 18 years ago on a kitchen counter when you decided a sticky note was a substitute for a soul. I didn't wait for his rebuttal. I pulled the original, non-forged medical records from my own folder, the ones notarized in London, documented by international specialists, proving Aunt Dahlia's cognitive brilliance until her final breath. I laid them on the table like a winning hand in a high-stakes game. The forged report Hadden had produced in Chapter 5 wasn't just useless now. It was a smoking gun of criminal intent. In the eyes of the law, they hadn't just lost their money. They had committed a felony in an attempt to get it. Hadden lunged toward me across the table, his fingers curled like claws. "You nobody! You parasite! Who do you think you are? You're just the girl who cleaned the floors and lived on our scraps. You're nothing!" I stood up slowly, the movement commanding and effortless. I removed my glasses and looked him directly in the eye, allowing the forensic mask to slip just enough for him to see the 13-year-old girl he had left behind. I let him see the fire in the eyes of the child who had survived his coldness. "My name is Wanda Mountain," I said, and the name felt like a declaration of war. "I am the daughter you erased because I didn't fit into your budget. I am the girl who warmed a burrito in a dark kitchen while you were in Florida. And I am the woman who has spent the last 3 years auditing every single lie you've ever told." The silence that followed was deafening, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the breath from Vila's lungs. Her jaw dropped as she finally looked at me. Not as a servant, not as an obstacle, but as the daughter she had deleted. She saw the face of the child she had left to starve, now holding the keys to her entire financial future. "I am not the person you threw away," I thought. "I am the person who survived you, and I do not need your apology to be whole." Looking back, I realized that my survival was the ultimate rebellion. I slid a thin blue folder across the mahogany toward Hadden. It was a sleek professional dossier, devoid of the sentimental weight of the Dichuk. "The will is the end of Aunt Dahlia's story," I said quietly, the weight of the moment settling into my bones. "But this folder is the beginning of mine. Look at the logo, Hadden. Do you know who your lead auditor is?" Hadden's hands were shaking so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm as he pulled the documents out. He stared at the federal seal of the Internal Revenue Service and the sharp, decisive signature at the bottom. "Wanda Mountain, Lead Forensic Investigator, Criminal Investigation Division." Hadden stared at the federal seal on the folder with a vacant, hollow expression that suggested his brain had finally stopped trying to find a way out. He finally understood that my presence in this house for the last few years hadn't just been a career. It was a 3-year undercover audit into the identity theft ring he had built out of desperation and greed. The blizzard outside began to settle, the violent whiteout giving way to a crisp, pale Chicago sun that broke through the clouds, casting sharp shadows across the mahogany table. I stood up, smoothing my coat, my voice carrying the steady, rhythmic weight of a woman who had finally reclaimed her voice. "The truth is not a weapon of revenge, Hadden," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "It is a tool of restoration, and today, the numbers have simply reached their inevitable sum." I explained the mechanics of his downfall with clinical precision. By using my social security number to funnel predatory loans and hide the assets of his failing LLCs, he hadn't just committed a family betrayal, he had committed multiple counts of federal wire fraud and tax evasion. The audit of retribution hadn't begun with Aunt Dahlia's passing. It began 3 years ago when the IRS flagged discrepancies in his filings. I had chosen to lead the investigation personally to ensure the evidence was airtight, protecting Dahlia's estate while preparing for the day the vultures would eventually land. The silence in the library was suddenly broken by the low, pulsing rhythm of sirens. Blue and red lights began to dance against the limestone walls of the foyer, visible through the tall, frosted windows. Federal agents and Chicago police were pulling into the driveway, executing the warrants I had spent months perfecting. I watched Hadden's face crumble, the realization hitting him that he was no longer a man fighting for an inheritance, but a man fighting for his freedom. Have you ever noticed how the weight of a lie only becomes unbearable when you are forced to carry it into the light of day? We moved into the grand foyer, the air smelling of ozone and cold winter air as the front doors were opened. Vela and my sisters began to beg, their voices a jagged chorus of panic. They tried to use family as a shield, clutching at my sleeves and weeping about blood being thicker than water. I remained stoic, my hands steady and my heart calm. I looked at Vela, seeing her not as a mother, but as a woman who had allowed her fear of poverty to consume her conscience. "Wanda, please," Vela sobbed, reaching for me. "We're your parents. You can't do this to us. Think of the shame." I didn't pull away with anger. I simply placed my hand over hers and eased it off my arm. "I am thinking of the truth, Vela. And the truth is, I stopped being your daughter 18 years ago on a kitchen counter." Despite everything, I allowed her to take her personal handbag and her essential heart medication before the officers led her away. I showed her a flash of human compassion that she had never afforded me. I wanted her to know that while she had tried to erase me, she had failed to destroy the kindness Aunt Dahlia had planted in my soul. I have not become like them, and that is my greatest victory. I turned to Hadden as he was being handcuffed. His eyes were vacant, the arrogance completely drained from his posture. "I do not wish you pain, Hadden," I said softly, the words feeling like a final release. "I simply wish for a world where my name is no longer a tool for your deception. You cannot expect a harvest of loyalty from a field you planted with betrayal." The family was led out into the cold Chicago air. I stood at the portico, watching the black and whites pull away, their sirens fading into the distant hum of the city. The house they had planned to treat as a clearance sale was now officially, legally, and irrevocably mine. But more importantly, the name Wanda Mountain finally belonged to the woman who bore it, not the ghost they had tried to create. I returned to the library alone. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting a warm orange light over the rows of books. I walked to the fireplace and pulled a small, faded yellow sticky note from my wallet. The original note from 2008 that I had carried like a lead weight for nearly 2 decades. I read the graceful handwriting of my mother one last time. "Stay at a friend's. Back in a week." I let out a long, slow breath and dropped the paper into the embers. I watched the edges curl and blacken, the words that had defined my trauma turning into harmless, drifting ash. The nen, the long, suffocating pressure of my past, finally gave way to a profound exhale, a release that made my lungs feel light for the first time since I was 11. I understood then that closure doesn't come from an apology. It comes from the moment you decide you no longer need one. Thalion entered the room quietly, the heavy click of his shoes on the hardwood sounding like a period at the end of a long sentence. He handed me a heavy brass ring holding the keys to the estate and a set of management documents. "It's done, Wanda," he said, his voice filled with a rare, quiet respect. "The Dahlia Carlton Foundation for Displaced Children is now legally active. You are the sole architect of its future." I took the keys, their weight familiar and grounding. I walked out onto the balcony, the cold wind no longer feeling like an enemy. I looked out at the Chicago skyline, the skyscrapers gleaming like pillars of salt in the afternoon light. I was no longer the extra piece, or the forgotten middle child. I was a woman standing on her own ground, exactly where she chose to be. Looking back now, I realize that a house is built of stone and wood, but a home is built of the truth you are willing to stand for. I ran my fingers over the balcony railing, feeling the strength of the limestone. I didn't realize it then, but the story didn't end with the arrest or the die chuck. It began the moment I realized that my value was never theirs to decide. Have you ever lived a moment where the air finally felt like it belonged to you? I am no longer a guest in my own life. I turned back into the warm, golden light of the house, closing the balcony doors on the cold wind of the past. For the first time in 18 years, I wasn't just safe, I was finally home. Looking back on this journey, I've learned that your worth is never something others get to decide, especially not those who chose to walk away when things got difficult. Justice isn't always about the noise of a courtroom. Sometimes it's just the quiet, undeniable power of standing in your own truth while the lies finally burn to ash. Blood might make you related, but only integrity and a sheltering love make you family.